as we have quite a large panel, I'm just going to jump right into things. And you might have noticed that we have two panel members that are not necessarily corporate philanthropies. And there's a reason for that. As observers of this space, they have a wealth of information in terms of best practices that they've seen across the board from a bird's eye view. So I actually want to start the discussion there and ask both, both Alanna and Myma to kind of touch upon what they've seen as best practice approaches in this space in terms of corporate philanthropy or their own organizations' strategic social investments in Africa. Maybe we start with Alanna.
Okay, thank you. It's good to be here. And yes, it is a bit non-traditional. I'm with UNICEF. It's a large UN agency, so very, certain perceptions might come to mind about what we do in our work with governments and communities. But what I'd like to talk about today is the actual journey we've had, in particular over the last 3 to 4 years, of engaging with the private sector on the continent and some of the lessons that we've learned. But before I share some of those insights, just wanted to mention the reason why we did it. And Tsitsi mentioned this in her opening remarks. Of course, we know that the economies are just growing fast. There's countries beyond the traditional Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. We've got the Ghanas and Cote d'Ivoire's and Ethiopia's economies really going. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But then the flip side that many of you have mentioned today is that population growth. And yes, it does provide an opportunity. 1 billion children in Africa by 2050. 1 in 13 globally by 2050 will be Nigerian. So UNICEF, as it looked at as its overall strategy on the continent, but particularly as it relates to engagement with the private sector, was thinking this is an urgent issue. We must channel the investments that are available on the continent and that we can support and work with in order to make sure that we do get that demographic dividend and not that demographic disaster. UNICEF just launched a report last week called Generation 2030 that highlights those. So that was the reason. Now I'll jump right into, in the last just a few years, some of the insights and what I kind of deem as what I think is success, particularly in working with business and multinationals, be they African multinationals or be they foreign multinationals who have a very strong base here in Africa for many years. The first one is in terms of looking at what best practice success for investment in Africa is really when we see businesses who have embedded the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in their actual business. Now, what does that mean? You all probably know better than me. But as I look at it, it's those who not only just have a sustainability plan and a strategy on a shelf or something at senior management level, but really take some of the SDGs, those that are maybe core to your particular business, be it in health or education, and then really work those across all of the divisions and all of the teams so that the SDG goals are owned and that there's KPIs that each team can feel that they're really contributing to. Now, what that lays, in addition to having a very strategic, a strategy and sustainability focus, is the ability to then have strategic partnerships with organizations on the continent that can help you deliver your goals. And within that, I think it also really lays the groundwork for shared value. That's one of the focus areas that UNICEF has had in its partnerships over the last 3 to 4 years. And that's shared value as a concept we're familiar with. It basically means that in addition to achieving the development aims, be it in education or health, that we also recognize that the business has to get something out of it in terms of return on investment. If we want scalable investment that we can replicate, businesses know that in addition to maybe a CSR budget that they might have at centralized level, that there are opportunities with their marketing budgets, with different business elements where in addition to financial investment, they can really contribute technical expertise, core assets, etc. So UNICEF recognizes that there must be a shared value approach. So I guess my first insight, and I'll go quickly on to the others, is the success means embedding the SDGs in your business. Now let me look at my notes here. The second one is a focus on outcomes rather than activities. So we're looking at strategic scalable investments to really achieve some of the aims that we need to, particularly with the population growth. then we need to think about impact and outcomes. Now that's different than looking at activities. There's a very good place for being able to say, I helped this number of children achieve X. That's very, very valuable. But if we're going to leverage across the continent, we need to think about the big outcomes. So a focus on those changes the dynamics of how we leverage investment, because we no longer think about it from a donor beneficiary point of view, but from a real leverage point of view. And my final point is around innovation. A lot of us talk about that, be it products, technology, or processes. But I think if we're going to really leverage investment from business, we need to leave space for innovation. And by that, not just using the assets of a company, their products, their expertise, et cetera, in very new and innovative ways and collaborative ways, but also leaving this space to breathe within the partnership or within the overall platform to fail, quite frankly. Knowing that, I'll just give one example, quality education, learning outcomes. I think our Minister for Education in Liberia mentioned it earlier. We have a lot of ways that we know that we can achieve learning outcomes, but no one has the proven foolproof, that's how you do it from A to Z. And partnerships, particularly with business and the corporate sector, can enable us to find those new innovative ways, and we need to leave that room in the business. So those are my three things: embedding SDGs in the business, focusing on big impact and outcomes, and then innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. Nana mentioned that I do not represent a corporation, and in some respects that's true. But Harvard is an academic institution, and I sit on the board of the Harvard Center for African Studies, the true representative of whom is here somewhere. Obenuwa, yes. All right. Now, what Harvard does in a way is sort of talk the walk or walk the talk. I'm not quite sure which way to put it. Harvard essentially says to itself, we're an academic institution. We have an incredible amount of research and knowledge and strength about lots of different things that impact Africa. Lots of the big issues that we look at nowadays: education, climate change, health, all these major concerns, religious issues, violence, terrorism, and has essentially decided, under the auspices of the Center for African Studies, to put all of this knowledge and learning together and to look at this against what the corporate world in Africa is doing. And in a sense, challenge them and say, look, we've got this research available, we have this information available. We need from you data, we need information, we need ways in which to spread this learning around the continent, because we have a certain convening power, we have a certain international strength, we have a certain ability to share this information in ways that are neutral and apolitical. So these are the ways in which we think we can use our resources. And having done that, some of the learning that I think is beginning to come out, and the center is relatively young in its current form, but some of the things that are beginning to come out, and one of the things that I would certainly like to just at least focus on, is the importance of corporates understanding what it is exactly they are trying to do with their philanthropy. We were just having a little discussion at my lunch table about the fact that often the philanthropy that is done by corporate organizations follows the boss. So when the head of the organization likes polo, it's suddenly all about polo, and the next person who comes loves art, and it becomes about art. And that does not completely provide the kind of philanthropy that we would like to see, which is philanthropy that is strategic, that is focused, that is effective for that reason. And these are some of the learnings that we're beginning to find from the work that is done by the center. And I won't speak too long about that, so I'll comment on it further later.
Thank you so much. So I think with those two interventions, yes, clap for them, of course. I think with those two interventions, we've kind of set the context on a macro level. So I want to now turn to our private sector colleagues to get some reactions from what has been said. In terms of best practices, we've heard strive for the big outcomes. We've heard a focus on innovation, on embedding the SDGs as KPIs, and also spreading data and information that is produced by the likes of the African Development Bank, the Harvard Africa Center, etc. So I pose the question first to my right, that how is your organization leveraging off of those best practices? What best practices have you gleaned from your operations? And to what extent are those informing how you approach geographic spread, scale, and replicability of your work?
Sure. Thank you. Before I start, I really just would like to say a big thank you to this amazing organization. I just arrived an hour ago, and this is just phenomenal. What Africa Philanthropic Forum is doing, positioning this beautiful continent for us to really take our destinies into our own hands and drive the sustainable development of our continent. I think this is just really one powerful place to be. So we need a round of applause. So thank you for being here. I think the time is now. If we look across the globe, if we look at what is happening, for lack of a better word, our donor communities, externally those who give us some money to do our development work, more and more governments are beginning to look within themselves. I don't want to cite governments here, but I think we all know what is happening around the globe. But if we as Africans do not take our destinies into our own hands, bring our resources together, and take this continent by the horn and actually just own it and do the transformation ourselves, we will never realize the Africa that has potential. We keep saying Africa has potential, Africa is the next frontier. When are we going to realize that potential? I think it sits within ourselves. But we, the private sector, are saying to ourselves that we need to lead this transformation, this important transformation that's going to take this continent to the next level. Shame on us if we don't develop the communities that we make our commercial gains from. Our customers, our employees are the communities that we serve, and therefore we do have a responsibility to develop this continent and the communities that we serve. And this is the position that Ecobank has taken. So thank you. So a couple of years ago, to Myma's point around how philanthropy or CSR initiatives and goals follow leaders or CEOs, we took a step back and said we will no longer use our CSR money to sort of do golf. This is what we were using. Yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. If we look at what any thriving environment or society has, it's health, it's education, and it's financial inclusion. Without a strong health system, we're not going anywhere, which we don't have at the moment. Without a strong foundation, an education foundation, we will continue, the best and the privileged will continue to send their kids overseas for education, and the rest will continue to strive, and unemployment will just get out of the roof. We will never realize the future leaders that we were trying to educate. Without the informal sector actually participating in the economy of this continent, only the few will thrive. And therefore, for inclusivity and for everybody to be part of this, we decided to change our strategy 2 years ago to focus on health, education, and economic inclusion. But then, so that's internally. So we've partnered with several organizations, such as globally with the Global Fund. We're very active with the Global Fund. We contribute financially to end malaria, which really, it's a shame that malaria is still big on the continent, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's taking away lives of beautiful babies. So we are working very passionately with the Global Fund. We have found ourselves and positioned ourselves on the board of the Global Fund to really drive transformation on the continent through the Global Fund. In Nigeria, for example, as we contribute financially to the fund to work in Nigeria, but we also do what we call in-kind, and this is what you were referring to as innovative sort of approaches. We sit around the table and we work with the recipients of the funds. We support them in managing the financials or the finances, the grants that they get from the Global Fund. Because most of these recipients, the NGOs, don't have the capability financial management to actually manage the funds appropriately. And therefore, if they're not able to sort of manage the funds, then they don't get grants the following year. So we're helping to unlock all of that. We're doing similar projects on education, financial inclusion. We have become very massive in that space because our whole consumer bank strategy in 2017 was around financial inclusion. Our digital transformation initiative or strategy for the consumer bank is actually moving our clients from 31 to 100 million, 31 million to 100 million. The variance there is the informal sector that we're bringing on board to include them in the financial economy. These are just a few in the interest of time. Now, so that's internally. Now, externally, what we've said to ourselves is that we cannot do this by ourselves. And more and more what we see are different organizations, different high net worth individuals, different private sector organizations, multinationals, doing their own thing. Without collaboration, we ain't going nowhere. So we have formed what we call Africans for Africa, which is a collaboration between Ecobank, the Global Fund, and an organization called My Africa Thriving, led by a high net worth individual. And we are saying that all Africans need to come together. The private sector needs to do this, to lead this transformation, collaborate, bring our resources together, and drive a sustainable, and the word is sustainable, and accelerated transformation of the continent. We're still focusing on the same things, education, health, and economic inclusion, but this time we're saying all of us should come together to drive this transformation.
Thank you, Julie. So I wanted to ask Norman the next question, and the question is, how do you see your organization's strategy in the philanthropic space? Are you adopting a more continent-wide approach, a localized approach? How are you developing the strategy for reaching those that you need to reach throughout the continent, particularly in multiple countries?
Thank you. Yes, I think my organization is Econet Group, as you know, and Mrs. Masiwa chairs one of our philanthropic arm of the Econet Group. I'm more on the private side of the Econet Group, that is the corporate side of the business. And I would say philanthropy sometimes we should not, I guess, overstate that it actually happens when a business does good business. When we are in our markets and when we are creating employment, we are doing very good philanthropy. You know, it's not always about giving people fish to eat, it's about teaching them how to fish. And for us, it's very important as a business that we focus on that. One of the major problems we have in Africa is youth unemployment. So I'll give you a classic case study on some of the propositions that we have done, where we have used the innovation to transform the continent. We've got a platform that we are rolling out across 17 countries right now. We have employed, just in the past, shall we say, 18 months, 10,000 young Africans that were previously sitting idle in the continent. We've actually created a platform for them to start trading. Now imagine Uber. We've created an Uber for highly skilled people in Africa. I've got 3,000 of them here in Nigeria. I've got 2,000 in Kenya. These people yesterday were just sitting on the sidelines. They could be a very qualified electrician, but they were waiting for a call to come through to say, come and fix my electrical problem in my house. But we realized that these people can do a lot of other things, including they could deploy our media platform called Kwese. They could actually come to your home and deploy Kwese, and I'll pay them $20 for that job. The same guy, imagine, is called Peter. I have also trained him how to do fiber to home. I was reading today, the new oil for Africa is called data. Now, every country has got this oil, by the way. You don't need to have a Delta state to be an oil-rich country. You just need to mine the data that's in your country by deploying fiber in that country. Now, Peter, remember Peter again. I have now trained Peter how to do fiber to home, to pull the fiber from the road to your house, or from the road to your school, so that your school becomes a smart school. Peter, stay with me. Peter, I've also taught him how to do a smart home, or a smart office, how to deploy a generator, and all sorts of skill sets. Overnight, I've converted Peter from just a basic electrician who was sitting on the sidelines waiting for a call to a guy who can do 6 to 7 deployments at any one point in time. And thanks to the 725 odd phones, mobile phones that are sitting in Peter's hands today, I'm able to put an app on Peter's phone that he now uses to actually receive those jobs. So in the same way today Uber is being used to call in a service, I actually use Peter to doing a number of jobs. In Africa today, Peter is earning around $75 to $100 a day. And there are 10,000 Peters that we've created. Now, this for us matters. So I challenge that. I think Africa has become exceptionally entrepreneurial today. If you go into Nairobi and you see some of the concepts that they've come up with, we like to follow through those concepts and see how we can empower some of these young entrepreneurs. And as Econet Group, we use our media platform to actually create that entrepreneurial platform for sharing. But we use also some of the services that we are rolling out in the continent to be able to empower Africans. So it matters for us that we create employment. It matters to us we do business properly. There are 4 things I need to fix in Africa if I was the president of Africa. 1, I'm aspiring, so take that as a campaign. That's a campaign, but there's no post anyway, so I'm safe. But I would like to fix probably 4 things. 1, telecom infrastructure in Africa. 2, energy. 3, health. 4, leadership. I will not talk about the 4th one, but in some day we'll discuss that. I wrote about it, but we can talk about the 4th one. The telecom infrastructure is well developed now. The energy sector is one of the biggest opportunities that exist, both from an employment creation point of view, but also as an enabler to create a real chance for transformation in Africa. We currently rolling out solar across the whole continent in all the 17 markets that we operate. We simply come to your offices, we put solar panels on top of your roof, and I'm looking at you, Nana. We put solar panels on top of your roof, we put it in your carport. Can you imagine your roof today is gaining a lot of dust? But it could be an energy generating asset, which could improve your office by almost 25%. And for doing all that, we actually have designed a model where we will pay for it. You pay for the power. Imagine a continent that can't generate power, but is exceptionally inefficient in the way we use it. So for us, philanthropy is about doing business well in Africa.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all that Econet's doing. It's fantastic. I've heard from, well, all of you at this point, and there's a number of recurring themes that are coming out even from the discussions from this morning in terms of the sectors that we need to focus on. We've heard youth unemployment, renewable energy, and Julie mentioned Ecobank's partnership with the Global Fund, etc. What I think would be interesting to hear from Tonye is, to what extent do you work bilaterally in the private sector? Have you had any partnerships across with other private sector philanthropies, and what do you foresee in that space?
That's actually a very, very good question. But to help me frame the answer to this question, I'd just like to know who I'm speaking to in the room. So how many people here are from the private sector? How many? Okay, very good. And the rest are from civil society? I see. Okay, government? All right, self-employed? Pure philanthropists? All right, okay. And those who'd never put up their hands, I have no idea why you're here. But having said that, talking about the transition and where we are today, I happen to say, how many of you have heard of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? How many? Seriously? Okay, how many are actively participants in the SDGs? All right, excellent. Now, one of the most shocking things that we found out over the last year or two is that the awareness of the SDGs outside of rooms like this is actually very, very small. The awareness is very low. And yet, it's one of those tools that, I don't know if it came about by accident or if it so happened to just fall on the laps of people, but it came out and it so happens to be probably the best tool and the best thing that has happened in this world if we're going to make a difference at all. And how has it played in the private sector? Today, I sit on the advisory board at the United Nations level with the SDGs, at the SDG Fund, where we started off working, first of all, with private sector coming in and working with the United Nations to try and figure out that how can the private sector play an active role in addressing the SDGs? And what we found out when I first walked into those halls was that there was this massive issue of trust. There was total mistrust between the private sector and the multilateral agencies, between civil society and private sector, and of course between private sector and private sector. So one of the things that you had was a trust issue, a huge trust gap. And we had to bridge the first level of just sitting in the room and formulating language that would allow private sector and multilateral agencies to talk and come around this idea called the SDGs and figure out how we're going to make it work. The beautiful thing about it was as soon as the private sector began to take a look at these 17 goals, we all found out that it was extremely good for business, extremely good for business. It gave a narrative towards what you had been doing all along. And now you knew that you could identify something and have a name to it that would help you move. And one of the last aspects of the SDGs is on partnership and collaboration. And that's where we now know that you must sit down, that's SDG 17, that you have to sit down, and if you're going to scale, if you're going to make a difference, then you must work together. So we've set up the private sector advisory group. And the private sector advisory group here in Nigeria is bringing all the private sector so that we do not do multiples of exactly the same thing and you have absolutely no skill because you are doing it. We're all doing it. So you'd find, someone talked about malaria, you find a lot of people doing things on malaria but no skill. You find a lot of people doing things on education but no skill. A young man was talking to me about giving cycles in education, and it's one of many things that we do, but no skill. And what's the difference? Because we're not sitting down together, we're not collaborating, and we're not working together to do this. So we're driving that aspect of it to fruition. And one example as to where collaboration makes a huge difference. A couple of years ago, the Carter Foundation we came across the work they were doing in the eradication of guinea worm in Nigeria. And they were finding it extremely difficult in making headway. It wasn't because there was no money. The funding was there from their end. It wasn't that they did not have the will. They absolutely had the will to do what they needed to do. But every single time, the money had to go through government sources and it just would not get done. And so guinea worm just wasn't moving. So we came across the problem, and like a private sector thinking, we sat down and said, what's the problem? You need to get boreholes in location, and you need to get it from the highest areas of prevalence all the way to the bottom. You have all the data, you need intervention, and you need intervention on the ground. And so we sat down, stood behind the scenes, because if you came out then in front, you'll get killed. So we sat behind the scenes, identified exactly where they needed to do it, and began to put boreholes in the areas where they needed. And then trained the people on how they would maintain the boreholes, because after the guinea worm has been eradicated in a community, then the water becomes a source of life. And so we began doing that. And within 5 years, working with the Carter Foundation, guinea worm was eradicated in Nigeria, and we took that into Ghana, and we eradicated guinea worm in Ghana as well, doing exactly the same thing. And simple intervention, but that for me was the power of collaboration. You can do things when you identify the problem, you know exactly who you're going to work with, you identify what you need to do, and you go in there and you implement it. There's power in collaboration, but what do you have to do to bring collaboration? You have to address the issue of trust, and that's what we're dealing with.
Can I just make the comment that the other value that comes out of collaboration that is very clear is that you actually have more money to spend eventually. If a ton of people are doing exactly the same thing and it's being done in silos, you're actually spending more on administration, which is a big issue. I think that we've all found a lot of money is spent administering foundations that could be spent on actually solving the problem. So I think that this is something that's also important to bear in mind.
Thank you so much, Myma. That is very, very true. And thank you, Tonye, for your intervention. I want to now open it up to questions from the floor. I think we've gotten a lot of meat to chew on from our panelists. So if anyone has a question, if you could kindly raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Anyone? Yes, sir, in the front.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Godman Akinlabi. I primarily work as a pastor, but I also chair the board of our foundation, the Pieces Foundation. All right. I said I chair the board of Pieces Foundation, and we deal with street kids and all that, getting them off the street. All right. This is my question borders on collaboration. Within the faith-based charitable or philanthropic organizations, one of the issues we're dealing with is collaboration. And I just want to know if there's anyone that has a model or something you've done to get it to work better, because I believe it can be adopted even around the faith-based philanthropic organizations. Yeah.
Any other questions? We'll take a few and then we'll have the panelists react. Yes, okay, I see two hands.
Thank you to the panelists. My name is Maria Nasadi. I work for the Nabagereka Development Foundation. I would like to learn from any of the panelists, what is the worst mistake that you've ever done and how did you overcome it?
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Bickersteth from Development Africa, and this question is for Mr. Cole. You mentioned trust, and can you comment on the upcoming NGO bill that the Nigerian government is discussing? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Simi Wogugu. I'm the Executive Director of Junior Achievement. And my question is around volunteering, encouraging your employees to volunteer, creating a volunteer culture. And the reason I ask this is because we are talking about African multinationals. As Junior Achievement, a lot of our programs, or all of our programs, are taught by volunteers. And we found that when we go into the African companies, it's harder to get it, to recruit volunteers as a top-down initiative, where it's not an individual from the organization who's saying, I want to volunteer. We found in cases like Accenture, KPMG, that's a former Arthur Andersen, it's been part of the culture, so they all come out. What are you doing in your companies to inculcate that volunteering culture in your employees?
Ooh, more hands are going up. Okay, let's start with these four, and then we'll come back to this table. I saw both of your hands, so we'll come back to you guys. I want to ask Alanna to maybe touch on the first question on collaborating with faith-based organizations, if that's okay. Yes, or maybe a version of? Sure.
I might not exactly cover specific faith-based organizations, but I wanted to share a model of collaboration that I think has been developed over a period of years, and I don't know if Her Royal Highness is here, but it's in Uganda. And it's something that has taken root over a period of 3 to 4 years, where basically not only has the public sector come together and the local government to really look at investments, but then the private sector, underneath the umbrella of the Private Sector Foundation Uganda, with UNICEF support, to really bring the private sector together under one campaign, an Invest in Children campaign. It's called actually Invest in UG Children campaign. And that collaboration where you have it really around the public sector together, the private sector together, and then bringing in, of course, faith-based organizations, civil society organizations, where everybody has one aim, and it's about making sure that children's needs in Uganda and some of the indicators that they have around their campaign for 2030 actually reach that goal. It's been quite impressive, and now there's even talks, and it's very early days, so don't quote me on this, but about really looking at some innovative financing mechanisms as well to bring in, tens of millions of dollars. Again, it's just an early thing, looking at child grants. So I think it's just a collaborative model, and when you see umbrella organizations like a Private Sector Foundation Uganda, and that are in Nigeria and in Tanzania and many other countries, I think it offers a great model for collaboration.
All right. I'll answer, maybe I have 2 questions or so that are directed at me, so I'll see how best I do. Faith-based, what have I seen directly? Everybody wants to take glory for themselves, and it's wrong. Okay, so the minute you put yourself out there as the person who must be identified as the one doing it, you've already failed from the beginning. As soon as that starts, it's a problem. So we need to focus on the problem, the issue, and not on ourselves, first of all. What would help to do that? Data and analytics would help. The minute you can spread and show the data of impact that happens, and we all have the same goal, we want to solve this problem, whatever it is, whether it's children off the street, unemployment, drugs, mental health, whatever it is. Once we agree that that is the problem, and how we come about doing it should address that issue. But I think a lot of the time it's focused on ourselves and not focus on the problem at hand. I was asked about the NGO Bill. I'm not sure I remember exactly what that problem is, so I've heard a bit about it, but I'm not sure I can address it in detail. But if I remember right, it also has to do with Christian faith organizations, and is that the one? Okay, so let me step back from that because I'm not sure. Volunteers on staff, and how do we get our staff to volunteer? One of the things that we started doing, first of all, even before we moved from the normal work of what they used to call CSR, which companies are pulling away from because the intonation of it is very wrong, the way it's gone. What we started doing in our corporation was that we even called it PCSR at the time, where it was a very personal thing that we drove in every individual, that they had to be personally involved, not on the corporate side, but they had to be personally involved. So it was a very personal thing that they went out, they volunteered, they participated, they went to schools, they taught in schools, they did education, but they were all involved. They brought ideas themselves that were very personal to them, and we went out to execute it as a body. So we got them involved in what ideas we were bringing and how we executed it. But we felt that if you could inculcate in the company the entire being, that what you are there for is to make a difference in the lives of the people that you serve, then it makes a big difference. The last aspect to that, in how we deal with communities, we work in the oil producing communities. Now I'm from the Niger Delta, I've seen the worst of it, and I know how bad it is there. And one of the things that I said to my staff recently is that we have to get to a place, and it's very hard to get this mental thing across, but I'll just give you an example of how we deal with this issue head on. Now, every oil company that operates within the Niger Delta, once you get in there, the first thing that you do is you encompass your entire facility, your staff and all of that within the walls. So you build a security fence, everybody comes in, you fly them in or you drive them into the place, they just go straight into a camp and they leave. And I said to my people, as far as I'm concerned, if we continue doing that, you are never ever going to be, you will never be able to talk to the communities one-on-one and they will believe you. So we are going to work on a situation where I don't want to see any fence around our camps, around our facilities. In fact, we should not have camps. I want our people to go and live in the community, engage with the community, deal with the community. Now, it's a very, very difficult step for you to cross mentally. But I want them to cross it. And I said to them that if we do not cross that, then we're never going to have any kind of impact in the Niger Delta. What they would see is that the companies come, they will see you as an outsider, you come, you do some intervention, and you leave. And they will continue to resist you. So that's the approach that we've taken. And we're working actively to see how. Now, I have different stories as to how we get about doing that. And I've given them ideas. I know how to get there, how to get into people's houses, how to sit with them. Like Sissy said, how you get into the community and sleep with them and eat with them and be friends with them at that level first of all and begin to move on. But if you continue doing this us versus them issue, it's not going to work. And so we have to break that cycle. And this is how we're doing it one-on-one in the communities that we work.
I just wanted to address the first question also on the faith-based and collaboration. And I actually had a talk 2 months ago at this MCI where the same question was asked: how can the faith-based groups collaborate with private sector, also with government? And what are some of the impediments to that? I think he pointed to the right issue of too much egos involved and not focusing on the real issues. But part of the problem was to actually find common ground where members of the faith community, some of them actually love to do business. And unfortunately, there are actually certain types of groups of faith that don't seem to create a good environment for doing business. In fact, we're talking about pastors in particular who actually forget their primary reason for being where they're supposed to be. So we said, how do we incorporate the rest of the community into doing good business? And what are some of the areas where they can do business? And how can this particular group intersect with, say, the government? So we found places like agriculture is a very interesting place where most governments in Africa are trying to build agriculture because there's a food crisis looming. I mean, 400 million people in Nigeria needs to be fed at some stage. And the church has got a lot of members who actually would love to do decent business, which might actually mean better welfare of the church as a grouping instead of a situation where simply pastors seem to live off their members without actually creating opportunities for business. So I think such collaboration, there has to be a shared objective, and that needs to intersect, say, with the government. And if you look at agriculture, it was a classic opportunity where the church, the government, and the private sector could meet. We, as a technology company, we have actually created a technology today where if you have got 2,000 cows, I can put a little chip around each of your cows today in Africa, and you'll be able to see them from your mobile phone wherever they are. You'll be able to tell the state of your cow, whether anyone is even harassing your cow, even if it's one is sick. You can get all that with my technology. Now, someone then said, but I don't have a farm. Then we said to the church member, you don't need to have a farm to be a farmer. Don't worry, your neighbor there has got a farm which is underutilized. So take your 50 cows and put them there. I'll put my chip on them, and you'll be able to see the welfare of your cow and get into a partnership with the guy. And the government said, oh, we like that conversation, because all of a sudden, we're beginning to improve things. If you're in Nigeria, a few years ago, Nigeria used to live off agriculture until we found oil. Then we forgot. But I think now we're having the same conversation again. So we are trying to say for that collaboration to work, the church needs actually to come to the table and do business, proper business. Use your masses to do business. We can also teach you how to do crowdfunding because we're a fintech company. So we'll teach you how to do crowdfunding. Now you're doing good business and you start to see that collaboration beginning to make sense.
Can I just comment on something? I just want to comment quickly on, I don't know if the question about the NGO bill was addressed to the I think there were a couple of things, and we won't go into them in detail, but one of the things that I think the bill sought to try and do was to try and make NGOs more responsible citizens within the countries in which they operate. You can quarrel with the way it was done, you can quarrel with the actual content of the bill, but it is something that I think is important to think about for a number of reasons. Some of the NGOs actually do, in some ways, a little bit more harm than good. So that needs to be thought about. So when the bill says that NGOs must be registered, there's a certain thinking to that. It does allow for a very chilling effect if the registration means that they cannot do what ideally they should do in certain aspects of life, like civil society organizations that are trying, for example, to ensure the freedom of the media. But there are other NGOs who are not necessarily being as helpful as they should be. There are some NGOs that are literally families who have set themselves up as NGOs. So these are things that I think any responsible government must give some thought to. So that's one thing. The second thing I think about the NGO bill is there is some concern around the issue of what is taxable activity and what isn't. If you are, forgive me, a church, and you are actually operating as a church, that is one thing. Do religious philanthropy, do everything you need to be. But when you start setting up businesses under cover of being a church, should that not merit a certain amount of taxable activity? Should the government not be a bit concerned? So although there are a lot of issues around the bill, I think sometimes we need to step back and try and understand what are the issues that we're trying to be addressed in order to have a proper discussion around that.
Okay, I think there are a couple of questions. There were a few questions, but I'm only going to touch on two. One is what is the worst mistake? And then the other one is the culture. I'll touch the culture first. At Ecobank, I'll touch it in my current organization and my previous organization, Citibank. At Ecobank, we're trying to force the culture of giving. We're also trying to force the culture of volunteerism by institutionalizing what we call Ecobank Day. And it's a mandate across all the 36 countries in Africa that we operate from and all 17,000 employees. On one day, on a Saturday, everybody has to go out, and we have a theme. It's coming up actually in a couple of weeks. We all have to go out and volunteer across the countries that we operate in. A couple of years ago, we built schools that we just opened. This year is around safe water. The other thing is actually to try to put in place, or a Citibank tried to put in place incentives. And the incentives is really around performance incentives, where on an executive level, all executives, part of your bonus, and in the private sector, when you talk about bonus and salary increases, it hits people's pocket, then they'll get up and go and volunteer, because as part of your performance review, it's how many hours you've spent in the communities. So those are a couple of ways that we did. What is the worst mistake that we have, or I have made, or my organization has made around CSR or foundation work or development work? Is being all over the place. I mentioned golf. I mean, how do you spend money on golf as CSR, right? Where is the impact? So you will spend a lot of money. The business can do that. Wealth management people can actually do the golf. We are development, we're a foundation. So for me, it's actually sitting back and saying, what is the strategy? What kind of impact am I looking to achieve? And being very, very discerning and being very, very, very focused. We're very, very strict. Otherwise, a lot of things will come on your table to actually invest in. You have to be focused, because we spend so much money on festivals and all the other things, and we have seen no impact in driving our beautiful continent to the next level.
I think, just to add to this point, that one of the ways in which you need to sort of gain impact, Julie, is to actually step back and think about what it is you really want to do. I think that for many organizations, as we started off by saying, they haven't really thought about what it is they want to achieve. and then at the end they don't measure the impact of what they have achieved. So they're not sure whether or not what they have done makes sense. So I think that that's something that you need to have a discussion about.
So my mistake. I think the worst mistake I made in this world of CSR and impact and all of that was believing I was a farmer. And I woke up one day, I impact youths, it's what I do, it's what I love doing. And the northern Nigeria was blowing up, it was tough, people felt that no one could go there. So I decided to go. I took some young people from Lagos. Have you ever been to the north? They were afraid. I said, no, we have to go. Let's go and make an impact in the north. So we went there. We got to the north and we asked around and they said, you know what? Agriculture is a place to go. So I said, great, we're going to go into agriculture. So I looked around, bought a farm, spoke to a couple of people, got seeds, got tractors, cleared this huge farm, and got the young people in the entire community, mobilized them, men, women, put them on the farm, and we became farmers. And I was excited about this whole venture called farming. And the crops grew. And I would go there and I would stand there and I would say, you know what, I'm making such an impact. This great work. And a few weeks before the harvest, I got there. When are you harvesting? What's going to happen? The money is coming back, so it's social. I mean, I really put money into it. And I said to them, I gave them this whole business pitch about how the seeds would go back and you use it as capital and you pay it back and the revenue will go blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And I got to the farm on the day that they were meant to have harvested. And the community had harvested the entire farm. And the people who I thought I was helping had stolen all the crops, they had harvested it, sold it, and they left just the front row and the back row of the crops. Basic business lessons that I know in my business I should never have done. And then I learned something very, very quickly. If you're going to do philanthropy and you're going to make it sustainable, do it the same way you do business. Just follow everything and follow it in the same way. And so I quickly remodeled the entire structure. I was going to pull out, but I thought about it. I'm here to impact life. So I changed the entire thing, changed the entire model, started again, now brought people who knew about farming this time around, got the ILF, started working with UNDP, SDGs, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And the model is taking a different turn. But it cost me a lot of money, and I learned a very hard lesson. I'm not a grassroots farmer.
Okay, so I'm getting the time signal that we only have 2 minutes left, but I do remember 2 questions on my left, so I do want to get those very, very quickly and see if we can get 1 or 2 panelists to address them, since I promised earlier.
Okay, I'm Tom Coogan from the U.S. African Development Foundation, and we actually, as an organization, believe in African solutions for African issues, and so it resonates very much with what I've been hearing. And I think there's 2 things that we've talked about, ways to ensure development. And one you talked about from the corporate social responsibility, addressing things like malaria and other things, very important. But then there's sustainable development, which we heard some of you talk about. And I think along the lines of sustainable development is, what we do is we fund small grassroots organizations, farmer cooperatives. We also fund off-grid energy, small enterprises, and youth enterprises. And we do that in a sustainable way. And we also look for corporate partners to do that. And so it comes back to the question of what was just asked is, what do you want to do as an organization and what do you want to achieve? And I think that really is kind of the question, which is you can achieve something very good when you've eradicated guinea worm, but then you move on to something else, like a business person. You've solved that problem, moved on to something else. And then sustainable development, which is encouraging and facilitating profitable enterprises to grow and expand, and so the money goes into the farmers' pockets. That's the second one. So really, it's both a question and kind of just a reiteration of something that I'm hearing.
Yeah, thank you. I think I like your trajectory on youth employment, youth empowerment. I think you actually started on what are some of the unique African problems that we have today? And do we actually need to go to Silicon Valley or all over the world to find the solutions for them? I've been in the technology space for 20 years, and I've seen tremendous innovation coming out of the continent today. If you go into Kenya today, there's a company there that has managed to put together farmers and the middle, has eliminated the middlemen, and has managed to get the crop straight to the consumer within record time, creating a very unique ecosystem out of that. Very unique. Energy is a major problem. Here in Nigeria, I'm sure we saw some little skits here. It was for sure, by the way, when the power goes off, because I needed to market my business every now and then. But we've got a problem of energy in Africa. How do we find a solution to the energy problem? We've got big banks like Ecobank here. I visited them a few weeks ago. They said, no man, we're willing to finance energy if you want us to finance. I have 3,000 installers here in Nigeria that can deploy energy across most of the SMEs, schools and whatever in Nigeria. So I've got a financier who is willing to finance it. I've got installers waiting to do it. I've got an investor who has got a huge vision for Africa. He's also willing to put his money down. So I wonder what is exactly missing, because I've got a lot of Chinese companies and American companies with panels, and they're willing to bring them here. So the solution needs to come out of the continent. So that, for me, is a major drive that is going to create a transformation for this continent. Can we find innovative solutions on the ground here, using technology, using some of the platforms that have been created to create that leapfrog? Let's leapfrog the continent into the next generation by finding homegrown solutions. I'm not a big fan of getting money from all over the place. It's not about money. It's actually strategy. It's us being able to articulate that strategy. As we say, resources follow strategy. So let's get the strategy right, the money will come.
And with that, I would ask you to join me in thanking our very esteemed panel, Alanna of UNICEF, Myma of the Harvard Africa Center, Julie of Ecobank, Tonye of Sahara Group, and Norman of Econet. I hope that you will continue the conversation with each of them throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you for your indulgence. And I would like to now ask the next moderator to come to lead our discussion on traditional institutions and cultural organizations and their role in shaping African philanthropy, Mr. Benga Oyabode. Oh, Oyebode. I'm so sorry.